Hi, folks. I think we'll start. Thank you all for coming today, and I want to start with my thank yous first to Margaret McElderry, who is the alum who left her money to Mount Holyoke to make this possible. She was a really outstanding children's book editor who had her own imprint at Simon & Schuster. Hi, come on in, have a seat. There's some seats right in the front. Here you go. I'm Corinne Demas. I teach in the English department. And I also want to thank my wonderful student helpers in this course, Rebecca Patel and Rend Abu El-Shar, who've done all of the real work here. And to thank my wonderful panelists. We have like a star-studded panel today. We have a bibliography, a very selected bibliography, because these people have written more than is there for each of the authors, and you might want to take a copy and see what they've written. Their books are on display in the atrium when you walk right into the library. They're all out there, and you can take them out and take them home on vacation. Their books are for sale at the Odyssey bookstore, and Leslea Newman has brought copies of her books if you are interested in purchasing any after this. We hope you'll stick around afterwards and have something to eat and come up and ask questions. I'm going to ask some of the questions that have been suggested to me by some of you and by some of our panelists, but then at the end we'll open it up for everyone. And Rebecca is going to introduce each of our panelists. Here you go, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us this afternoon. I want to build on a few things Professor Demas said to let you know that we have a great display right in the front of the library atrium of the wonderful books of all three of our guests today. That'll be up until Monday after the break, the 20th, I think that is. So definitely go spend some time with those books in the atrium. They're all so wonderful. So we've called today's discussion Writing for a Niche and Beyond, and we're so lucky to have three authors whose literary subjects have found them particular audiences, but who have also found human themes that have reached readers from every sort of audience you can imagine. We're excited to hear how they've extended their reaches as broadly as their wonderful books have allowed them to. So I'm going to briefly introduce each of them. I could say so much more. Barbara Diamond Goldin is the author of many picture books, story collections, nonfiction retellings, and historical fiction. She frequently writes on Jewish themes, bringing customs and history alive for young readers, and in 1997 received the prestigious Sidney Taylor Body of Work Award from the Association of Jewish Libraries for her contributions to Jewish literature for children. Her newest book, The Passover Cowboy, which talks about Jewish immigration to Argentina from the perspective of one little boy at Passover time, was just released in January, and it's great. Leslea Newman is the author of over 70 books in prose and verse for readers of all ages, including the groundbreaking classic Heather Has Two Mommies, which caused much controversy in the 90s and was just reissued in 2015. Among her recent titles, October Morning, A Song for Matthew Shepard, her moving 2012 YA novel in verse was named an American Library Association Stonewall Honor Book, and her charming 2015 Ketzel, The Cat Who Composed, received a 2016 Association of Jewish Libraries Sidney Taylor Award. She's also a past Poet Laureate of Northampton. And Ellen Wittlinger is the author of 17 YA and middle grade novels, including Hard Love, the recipient of a Prince Honor and a Lambda Literary Award. Her books have appeared on numerous ALA Best Books and Bank Street College and State Award lists, and her 2000 novel Parrotfish, a Lambda finalist that blazed a trail for the representation of trans teenagers in YA Lit, was released in an updated edition in 2015. Please join me in welcoming these wonderful panelists.
I thought I'd start by asking our guests today sort of how they got into the business, like what brought them to be writers, which is, this is the easy question.
Yeah, this is a very easy question. I've just always wanted to be a writer ever since I was 8 years old when I started writing poetry. There was nothing else I ever wanted to do. And for some reason, very young, I decided to start sending my work out. So I saw, for example, that there was poetry written by teenagers in 17 magazine. So I thought, well, why aren't they publishing my poetry? So I sent poetry to 17 magazine, and that was my first publication in 1976. And I never looked back.
Okay. I always wanted to be a teacher, and I did become a teacher. I've taught for many years now. I'm a librarian. But I love to tell stories. I made stories up when I would babysit, for instance, and that's the way I got people to call me back for another job, because I'd leave the story in the middle, and the kids would beg to have me back. So then I also, when I was teaching, I taught preschool first. I would tell stories. And I remember one time I told a Halloween story in a dark closet in this little preschool. And the next year, a little girl asked me for the same story. It was this, similar group of kids, and I couldn't remember it. So that's when I actually started to become a writer, because I couldn't remember any of the stories. So when I started to write them down, they didn't sound too good. So I took courses, and I was very lucky. I was living in the Northwest. I'm not from the Northwest, but I happened to be there. And Jane Yolen was teaching at Port Townsend Centrum, I think it was called. So I signed up for her class, and I was really excited because I'd never met her, and I always loved her books. So that's where I really started to be serious about writing. And it took 5 years to sell my first book. I don't have it here now, but it's just enough as plenty. But during those 5 years, I did a lot of writing for magazines and newspapers. It also took a little while to get into magazines, not like Leslea. But when I was writing for magazines, I found that they needed Jewish holiday stories. Those were the stories that were getting the most attention that I sent. And that's how I got into writing Jewish children's books. And I also went to a workshop where they said, write what you know. I don't know if any of you have heard that, but it's a common phrase. And so I remembered a lot of stories about my childhood, growing up, having fun at the holidays. So I wrote more and more Jewish holiday stories, and they were selling. They seemed to need them. And I also was living near a Lummi Indian reservation, and I was telling stories there at a Head Start where my friend worked, and they had no books on any Indian cultures or anything on the shelves. They were doing a lot of oral storytelling in other places, but not in the Head Start. So that's what got me into writing these two books, and I really enjoy writing about different cultures. So I'd say I'm interested in multicultural, but the Jewish one seems to be a niche for me. Ellen.
Thank you. I actually started out wanting to be a visual artist, a painter, and I went to a liberal arts college, but I majored in fine art, and I always did write poetry at that point, and it just seemed like something that I did, but I didn't put a lot of emphasis on it until my senior year in college. And there was a teacher there who really encouraged me, and whereas the people in the fine arts department were not particularly encouraging me. I think they were kind of thinking, "Ooh, she'll never make it." And he was very encouraging, and basically told me I should apply to the University of Iowa and try to get into their writing program. So I did, and I got in, and after that it was like, well, I guess I won't be painting any more pictures, because obviously I'm a better writer than I am a painter. So I wrote poetry for many years. I wrote plays and have kind of come back to doing that again. And I wrote some adult fiction, but it wasn't until I had a job as a children's librarian and I started reading the shelves so that I could recommend books to the young kids who came in, that I really started understanding what it meant, what a young adult novel really was. And I realized that I had a really good memory for the emotional part of being a teenager. Not so much, you don't really need to, you're not going to probably write that much about what actually happened to you, but you do need to have that emotional memory. And I just decided I was going to give it a try. And that was the thing that sold, and that seemed like, okay, this could be actually a career. So I kind of put everything else on hold and started writing for young adults.
I'm just going to add something to what Barbara said about write what you know. Actually, my mentor, Grace Paley, always said, write what you know you don't know about what you know.
Write what you don't know about
what write what you know don't know about what you know.
There's that too.
Yeah, think about that.
Well, now I want to ask you about how a niche has served you at all in your writing careers. I mean, I know that you all do more than your niche, but each of you has been really celebrated and kind of honored for particular kinds of books. Clearly, there are advantages when you go to sell books or market books, and then maybe for getting speaking engagements. So first, we'd like to hear about what are the good aspects of having a corner that's yours, and then we'll also talk about how that's a problem.
Does somebody else want to start?
Ellen, you can start.
Thanks. Well, I'm not sure I do have a niche. I mean, I guess if you say I have a niche, what that probably means is that about half of my books have gay, lesbian, or transgender characters in them, and about half don't. And I think because my characters kind of go all over the place, in a way, I feel like I'm not branded in exactly that way. What can I say about that? I started writing those characters. The first character was a lesbian character in Hard Love. And this was at a time, I was writing this in 1998, and there were very few books. There were some books that had, for young adults, that had gay or lesbian characters, but not many. And those that did were tended to have kind of a tragic ending. So my idea was just to write a book that, not a coming out book, but just a book that took a gay or lesbian, in this case lesbian character, who was already out, and she had other problems, she had other things going on in her life. And that's kind of always been how I thought of putting these characters into the books. That they're in this world, but that's not the main thing that's happening to them. They're not so much dealing with that issue. And I've lost complete track of your question about niche writing.
I mean, you have certain books that have gotten honors, like the Prince Honor, the Lion
Right.
Award. I mean, has that been a benefit? I mean, do you get speaking engagements? Do you get particular, fans that go?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get some fans. There are certainly fans that have followed me because of that. I don't feel like writing these GLBT characters has particularly been helpful to my career. And I think that's because partly I am not gay, lesbian, or transgender. And so I can't, people who are interested in having a speaker on that topic are not as likely to ask me. So I don't know, I'm proud of those books. I'm glad that I wrote them, but I don't feel like my career has necessarily benefited or not benefited. I don't feel like it's really gone either way because of writing into that particular niche.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I happened to fall into the Jewish children's books, finding out that they needed them, the magazine editors needed them, and the publishers needed them. I was lucky in that my first book, Justice is Plenty, was picked up by Deborah Brody, who was an editor at Viking. And she loved my work, and so for many years it was wonderful. We would work together. She would see what I wanted to write, and she would also ask me to write books that she had in her mind. And so we had a great collaboration. But she left Viking, I forget what year it was, and after that it was kind of hard. It was like starting all over again to find another editor. And that was difficult. So even though I had a niche, I had a good reputation, my books sold well, it was a difficult time. So I think such a close collaboration with an editor was hard to replace, at least for me. I don't know if anybody else has had that happen. Also, when I started writing Jewish children's books, there were very few people doing it. And then as the field grew, many more people started doing it. So they didn't need it as much from me. So I think that made it a little harder. I did, as I mentioned, I did do some other books, but I have a similar experience to Ellen. I have only done 2 Native American books, and it was partly because they especially wanted books from a Native American person. And so that's, I think, why I only did 2, because I had other stories in mind, but I didn't sell them. So sometimes in a writing career, you'll run across things like that, things you don't expect, and you kind of have to reinvent yourself. And now there's a group called PJ Library, which is out of West Springfield. So they've kept, it's started by a philanthropist, so they've kept some of my out-of-print books alive. I don't know if you know this, but most authors have most of their books go out of print after a while. So they've brought them back. Like, let's see, The World's Birthday was out of print, and they've brought it back. So PJ Library is a free service for people who want Jewish children's books. A lot of the families maybe have intermarried or a grandparent who's Jewish or whatever, so they can get free books, paperback, for the kids through PJ Library. They just sign up, and the books are paid for with this philanthropic foundation. The problem is it doesn't benefit the writer that much, but at least it keeps monetarily. But it keeps the books in print, which is really nice. And I think I must have 7 books with them, and my granddaughter gets one of mine occasionally, so that's really cool.
They come through the mail.
They come through the mail. So, what I'm trying to say is you can't predict. You don't know if your editor is going to leave, and our teacher, Jane Yolen, at least my teacher, always says she has a baby editor now, because all of them seem to go off and start a boutique or whatever. So you can't predict what's going to happen, and you kind of have to adjust and change with the market, I guess, for publishing.
Well, I have a lot of different niches, if that's the plural. So, for example, I have the Jewish niche. This is called A Sweet Passover. Also is carried by the PJ Library. So a lot of people who know that I write Jewish books don't know, for example, that I write a lot of books about animals. And a lot of people who know my animal work don't know that I also write adult poetry, which is actually where I started my writing career and what I still do primarily, as well as picture books. And then there are people that don't know that I'm a lesbian who writes about LGBT families, like Heather Has Two Mommies and October Morning, a song from Matthew Shepard. So I know most of the time when people talk to me about my niche, they're talking about the lesbian niche. So, to give you a little bit of a historical perspective, my first book came out in 1980. Heather Has Two Mommies came out in 1989. So still the internet was not what it is today. So people actually walked into bookstores. And so they would see, maybe one of your books, but they didn't have access to a place like Amazon.com where you just put in someone's name and all their books come up and you see that. So a lot of people, just thought I was a one-book wonder, and that Heather Has Two Mommies, which is my most well-known book, is that's all that I wrote. So the problem, or I'd say the challenge, the good and bad is bookstores, first of all, they used to be feminist or lesbian bookstores. So, you would go into a bookstore like that and there would be all these books by LGBT people. And if you were looking for a book like that, you knew exactly where to find it. Or if you went into a mainstream bookstore like B. Dalton, which I don't think exists anymore, there would be like a section that says, the gay books, the black books, the Asian books. So if you're looking for a book about or by someone from that population, you would know where to go. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage is if you're just looking for a great book to read, you're not going to find a book like that because, they don't call it the white section, but that's really what it was. So there was kind of good and bad about it. Now I think that things are more meshed a little bit because most people, for good or better or worse, buy things online. And so, there isn't like a section. You can just plug in anything and you can find what you need online. But I'm very proud of being a lesbian author. It's never hurt my career in any way, shape, or form. When I first published Heather Has Two Mommies, people did say, oh my God, are you going to publish under your name? And I was like, yeah, I didn't work this hard to give somebody else the credit. No publisher has ever hesitated to publish something of mine because I'm an out lesbian publishing LGBT books. I've just never had that problem. And in fact, it's been very good for me. It's really helped me be known and helped me get a foot in the door for all different kinds of publishing adventures.
Well, I wanted to ask, actually, Leslea, thinking about you as you say, oh, I don't want people to just think about me as Heather has two mommies. I mean, in terms of your talks, I know you're really popular on the lecture circuit, but you want to be known for other things. So how do you get beyond your niche?
Well, if somebody says to me, I love your book, and I know they're probably talking about Heather Has Two Mommies, I just kind of say innocently, oh, which one? I've published 70. And I put them back on the person, and they're like, I don't mean to really be cruel or embarrass somebody, but, I think if I was known for any one of my books, I would want to be known for more than one. So it's Heather, it's not personal. It's okay. I don't want to disturb Heather. But, I have a big mouth. I just tell people, some of the other things that I've written, and I talk about, my body of work. And, it's because I have so many other books, I don't think there are that many people that really think that that's the only book I've written anymore. Like I said, most, like if you're a student writing a paper on an author and you Google that author, all this other stuff comes up about you. So, it's not as much as an issue as maybe it was 20, 25 years ago.
I'm going to pass it down.
Sure.
Like Ellen, like your newest book, which doesn't have anything about that old subject, how has that been for you to promote?
So my latest book is something of a mystery set on Cape Cod. I think because I tend to jump around from one thing to another, people do like branding in a way. I liked this book by her, and so this one looks like it's kind of the same, and so I'm going to go buy that one. So if you're not doing that, you're taking a chance, and you just you may lose some sales because people don't know what that book is going to be about. They have to take a chance on it. This book also was on a smaller press, so it gets a little bit less marketing exposure. All those things mean a great deal. They really play into how the sales are going to be for any particular book. Am I answering your question? Is that pretty much it?
Well, as I said before, I love different cultures, and my latest book is called The Passover Cowboy. And I also like to study history and pick out little things that people don't know too much about, or I didn't know too much about. So what inspired that story was how Baron de Hirsch was worried about a lot of the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe that were suffering from the pogroms in the late 1800s. And so he also thought farming was the answer for people from these communities. So he would take a bunch of Jews from Eastern Europe and plop them into different places. One was Argentina. He also plopped a bunch into New Jersey where there were chicken farms, and somebody knows this story, and a bunch into Palestine and all kinds of different places. So I was fascinated. I came across a memoir, I think it was at the UMass Library, of somebody who had grown up in one of these Argentine colonies. He and his parents had come from Eastern Europe, and they relied a lot on the gauchos, that's the Argentine cowboy. So it was a really fascinating mix of the two cultures, and here they were put together like in 1 year. They were living in the same area. So that's what I based the story on, and I made up the story about a boy who admires a gaucho boy, and he learns to ride with him, and he invites him to a Passover Seder. And so I draw a lot of my stories that way, from different cultures kind of colliding, and Jews have lived all over the world, so it's kind of easy in a way to come up with these different instances. So in a way, I think a lot of my books, although they may have Jewish characters, are also universal, and that's what I'm doing more of these days.
I want to ask particularly Ellen and Leslea, what's it like to be a writer who writes a book where the subject matter is highly controversial and there are people in America who actually want to burn your book? I want to know how you deal with that emotionally as a writer and how you have the courage to kind of write about these subjects.
Well, I don't know if Heather Has Two Mommies was actually burned. I know it was defecated upon in a library. I know that it was stolen from many libraries and either not returned or returned with its pages glued shut. I have been called the Antichrist. A lot of things happened back in, but from 1989 through like the mid 90s. In fact, Heather Has Two Mommies was, I think, the ninth most challenged book of that decade. So, I have a whole actually hour-long talk just on this, so I will be brief. I think one thing that's important to know is that when I wrote the book actually at the request of a lesbian mom who stopped me on the street one day in Northampton and said she had no books to read her daughter, the sort of family like hers. Somebody should write one. So that's how Heather was conceived, so to speak, and how I became a children's book writer. Before that, I only thought of myself as a writer of adult literature. So nobody would publish the book. I sent it everywhere. Anyone who was publishing books at the time, I sent it to. And so a friend of mine and I published the books on our own. So I think it's just important to know the history of that. It had very humble beginnings. We actually had a little party, and we sat and stuffed envelopes and asked people for $10 donations so that we could raise the money to publish the book, and we raised $4,000 that way. So given that history, I never thought anyone would be interested in this book. I didn't think anybody cared about this book. I just thought, maybe if I was lucky, a couple of hundred lesbian moms would get hold of the book and have a bedtime story to read their kids. So, I was very surprised when the book, it had its own like logo on Channel 13 News in New York. I mean, it had theme music. It was read on the Senate floor by Senator Smith from New Hampshire as part of the congressional record. I mean, it just went absolutely insane. And so a lot of people have talked to me about courage, but I never really thought of myself as particularly courageous. I mean, someone just, asked me to do something, and I did it. And then what I did do was, when my book was attacked, and not only the book was attacked, but, the rights of lesbian families was being attacked. So I decided that I had to go out on the road and talk about the book and defend it and defend the rights of lesbian families. So maybe that's where courage came into play. But I just thought, well, if I'm not going to defend my book, who is going to defend my book? And emotionally, I'm from New York. I'm a tough cookie. I never believed anything that anyone said about me, really good or bad. I know myself pretty well. And if the book resonates with people in a positive way, I'm really happy. If the book makes people angry, it's touching something in them. I'd rather that, frankly, than it being ignored. And I actually had one experience, I think, that really meant a lot to me. I gave my talk about Heather Has Two Mommies for some reason in a shopping mall. I don't really know why, in Albany, New York. And afterwards, I always take questions, and a man stood up. He's wearing a suit. He was holding a thick book that looked suspiciously like a Bible. And he said to me, has anyone who disagrees with your point of view ever heard you talk and change their mind about LGBT families? And I said, well, not that I know of. And he said, well, now one person has. So, that made me feel like, if I ever think, that I don't really feel like doing these talks anymore or standing up for LGBT rights anymore because I'm tired, I always remember that. And I just think you never know what kind of effect you're going to have on one person. And then you never know what kind of effect that person's going to have on somebody else. And it just kind of goes on and on and on. So, again, I don't know if that answered your question, but there you go.
I will after she does, sure.
So none of my books with GLBT characters have been challenged. I've had some problems around them, but the one book that was challenged was a book by the name of Sandpiper. And Sandpiper has an oral sex scene on the second page. I felt it was very necessary in this book. I actually made the girl 16, although the story that I was kind of basing it on was a 13-year-old girl. Who was somebody that I knew. And I felt like this was a really relevant story to be told in this day and age. And there was a huge, I can't remember exactly it was somewhere in Alabama that it was stolen out of the school library, and they refused to return it, and then it got blown up into a big case. It was resolved. The school initially pulled the book, said they weren't going to put it back on the shelf, and the librarian stood up for it, and a bunch of the local kids did as well. And I believe that they allowed it to be in the library, but you had to, it was behind the librarian's desk or something, so you had to ask for it. So it became like a special weird thing that, you couldn't just go get it off the shelf. So that was not great. And I have to say, I actually felt worse about that than I thought I would. And I think, people, up until then, when I'd heard that people were having books challenged, sort of what everybody said about it was, oh, well, now you're going to sell 1 million books. Now it's a famous book, and so now everybody's going to just run out and buy that book. Well, that does not happen. I mean, maybe it happened to 2 books somewhere, at some time. Did not happen to this book. In fact, it was the first book of mine to go out of print. And aside from that, I just felt like, I was being chastised for writing a book that would hurt children, that children would read this and it would somehow hurt them, which was the last thing that was ever in my mind. To my mind, this book was written to help children, so that they, 13-year-olds or whoever, kids read up, so probably there were younger kids reading this book, so that they understood something about this issue. So I was really taken aback, and I have to say it hurt a lot more than I thought it would. Other than that, I have some of the books, I have had problems. Hard Love has had some problems, but none of them have been removed from circulation. I may have been removed from circulation in that, they don't want me to come to their schools and talk. I've been disinvited from places when they realized that somebody looked more closely at the books and decided, oh, we don't want her there. But nothing else has been formally challenged.
Well, mine's a little different. I grew up in a very Jewish neighborhood in Philadelphia, and when I was older and moved to the Northwest, I had started to write Jewish stories for magazines. I was very nervous because there had been an incident of neo-Nazis on Whidbey Island, and I forget, there was a bomb or something. And I knew there were a lot of neo-Nazis in Idaho. This was, I think when was it? Like the late 70s and 80s. So for instance, I remember very distinctly not wanting anything Jewish in my return address. I was living in Bellingham, Washington, which is a small city. There were very few Jews. There was a little synagogue. So I didn't want any of the return address to have anything Jewish. I was really afraid of, I don't know what, a bomb or something, I guess. And actually right now, it's coming around again. But anyway, then it turned out, I found out my mailman was converting to Judaism. So I thought, okay, I don't have to worry anymore. But it took me a while to really own that I was writing Jewish children's books. I felt like I was really putting myself out there. And but I got used to it. And then the odd thing is, when I moved back here and I was teaching at the synagogue preschool in Northampton, my first year there we had a bomb scare and we had to evacuate. So it was very weird to actually have that experience here, where I didn't actually have that experience there. And I later I taught writing at a Jewish day school in Springfield, and we also had a bomb scare. And of course now it's happening again. So that's my story about having the courage to come out as not very many of my people were out there. So, and I know tonight actually a interfaith group is going to gather in from the Springfield Jewish community, and I know of all faiths to support the community because of the bomb threat which happened last week.
Barbara, would you say anything about your experience as a librarian in terms of censoring books?
Oh, censoring books. Well, actually, this room is familiar to me. I took my master's in library science right here at Simmons at Mount Holyoke. I love being a librarian. I'm director of a small library in Southampton. You can come visit me if you want. Well, we have to be very careful not to censor books, and I love being a librarian because the American Library Association is so into things that I really believe in, you know, access to all, welcome everybody, free everything. We have computers that are free to the public, as you all know. So it is a little difficult because, like, I have to order, I do adult book ordering now, and I have to order some books that I don't agree with to balance all kinds of books. And I guess I'm doing a pretty good job because I'm not getting complaints. Southampton is a very divided community as far as politically, and so we have to be careful. But I remember when I was a children's librarian in the East Hampton Library, we had a book on growing up and in the youth section, and it had a whole chapter on all different kinds of families, including, you know, gay and lesbian families. And there was a woman there who, I think she still writes letters to the editor sometimes in the Gazette, who's very against having this kind of book in a library, so she challenged it. And I talked to my director at the time, and we decided to put it, I think, in upstairs in the young adult section or something like that. But then there was another case where one of the famous books that was written a long time ago, and I can't remember which one it was, but it had a very terrible scene in it that depicted black people in a way that was done in maybe the 1940s or 30s. I wish I could remember which one it was, but a patron came and said, look at this. Well, it turned out we had an original copy of the book, and later on they took that section out that depicted black people eating watermelon. I can't remember the scene. So you come across all kinds of things like that. Is that what you're talking about, Corinne? Exactly. Yeah, times have changed, and some of those early Goldin books would, you know, a lot of people wouldn't like them these days, where the girl is doing the cleaning and the boy is, you know, wearing the policeman badge or whatever.
Both Leslea and Ellen have had books that have been reissued, and I'd like to. Oh, and Barbara also. That's right. Your Cakes and Miracles. All three of my guests have had books that have been reissued. So I guess I'd like to ask your experience as an author. I know that in Ellen's case, I know you actually made some changes in Parrotfish, and Leslea, what that was like to have your book have a second life, and in some cases have a different illustrator.
Well, Heather Has Two Mommies just came out, I think it was last year. So this is, I'm sorry I didn't bring the original. It looks very, very different, but this is the new and improved version. So when my friend and I published it on our own, we didn't have the money for color illustrations, so the illustrations were all in black and white, so that's a huge difference. You know, the book was 25 years old, so the illustrations looked kind of dated, so it was nice to get new ones. And also, it was really great that I got to revisit the text, because I like to think that I learned a few things in the past 25 years and could make the book better, and, you know, you don't often get to do that. So I tightened the text. I made it much shorter.
I just have to. This is what they did in class today.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. So that was one thing that I did. Let's see. So if I can remember. Okay. So this says Mama Jane is a carpenter. She has two hammers, so she and Heather can build things together. I think it was something before, like, Mama Jane is a carpenter. She has two hammers. She and Heather are building two tables together. They're using nails. It just kind of went on and on and on. And, like, the gist of it is that, you know, you want them showing them doing something together that they're both enjoying. That's really all you need. So there was that. But one of the bigger changes was at some point, so here you can see there's a story time is going on, and the teacher is reading a story, and in the story, the child in the story happens to have a mother and a father, and all the kids are talking about what their dads do. And a kid says, "What does your daddy do?" David asks Heather. "I don't have a daddy," Heather says. And in the old version, it says that her face puckered up and she began to cry. And when I rewrote the book or changed it or tweaked it, I thought, well, that's really not anything to cry about. So I took that out. And so it just says, "I don't have a daddy," Heather says. She looks around the circle and wonders, am I the only one here who doesn't have a daddy? So, there's no tears, there's no feeling bad, there's just more curiosity. So I was really glad that I got to make that change.
Well, I didn't bring the book. Cakes and Miracles came out quite a while ago, and then it went out of print. So I had a new editor who actually isn't there anymore either. and she said she wanted to bring it back into print, but I had to cut it in half. But luckily, I had cut it in half because it was in Cricut. And so I had that to go by. But picture books now are usually much shorter than they used to be. The text is much shorter. And it did get new illustrations, which I liked very much. So it was an interesting experience. Well, see, I had cut it for Cricut. So, oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I took out a lot of details. I thought they were wonderful details, but, they went out the window. So you kind of pare it down to the plot, and yeah, it's amazing that you could cut out half of it.
Actually, can I just say, this actually started out as a chapter book, and I was really happy because I hadn't written a chapter book in so long. It was like 35 pages, and my editor really liked it and said, but I think it's a picture book. So from 35 pages, it went down to 5 pages, and that was really painful. But, it got published, so.
So the book of mine that has been reissued is called Parrotfish, and it's about a transgender boy. It was written 12 years ago, published 10 years ago. And actually, that probably sounds like a long time to you because you're younger than I am, but 10 years ago is just like, it seems like nothing. And yet the language changed so much from the time that I wrote the book until last year when I contacted the publisher. And this was actually at my request that they update it, because I felt like it just did not represent me or transgender people quite correctly. There was one word in particular. I wrote this book, I should say, with the help and the vetting of a friend of mine who is transgender. And at the time, there's one place in which the character refers to himself as a tranny. And at the time, my friend Toby said, "That's fine, I do refer to myself that way. I wouldn't want anyone else to refer to me, but I can refer to myself that way." But times change, and that word has become offensive. And so that, I felt we had to get that word out. That was the main reason that I wanted to redo this book. But because we were going to go back in and reissue, there were other things that we changed as well. One thing was there were a number of times in which the phrase was, I'm trying to think how it would be used. Someone might say, he is transgendered with an ED. Well, that is also, it's not offensive, but it's just no longer the way that word is used. It's just transgender. So there were maybe 6 times that had to be changed in the book. And then the other little thing that I changed was some of the criticism that I had gotten on this book was that he has a crush on this girl in his class who is part Japanese. I'm trying to think what else. If she's, I guess she's, what? African. I guess she is African American. Yeah. And I say that she's beautiful, and a lot of the criticism was that she was then being exoticized for being biracial and beautiful. So she's not beautiful anymore. I just took that out. I made her as, normal. I mean, she is still biracial, but I took out any references to her looks. So those are I think those are the 3 big things that I had to do. But the nice thing in my case was that I went to the publisher and asked them to do it, and they were willing to do it, and they came out with, within a couple of months, a whole new editions in both paper and hardcover. So I was lucky.
Some of you may have heard of the case, the incident with Lionel Shriver, who is a writer who gave the keynote address in September at the Brisbane Literary Festival. And she gave a speech that turned out to be very controversial about cultural appropriation. And she was very much against the whole idea of sensitivity policing. And it caused a huge furor in the writing community, and people came out on both sides very strongly. More recently, in an interview in the on NPR, she said, "We should all borrow from each other's cultures. We should be advocating that we use ever more diverse populations of characters in fiction, and the supersensitivity that is developing is discouraging writers from doing that." She called it fictional apartheid. And I guess I want to put that question out to all three of you. We all have our little territories and things that are sort of close to the bone and things that we feel we know best. Do we have a right to kind of own that territory? And how do you feel when writers who have no personal connection with your particular territory take it on?
Well, this is a very complicated issue. I can write on, I could talk about it from both sides, but I think the first thing that a writer needs to ask herself is, why am I doing this? What is my intention? What is my connection to this story? Why do I feel the story has to be told? Why do I feel like I'm the one to tell this story? There's a wonderful article or essay by Jacqueline Woodson, which you can find online, called Who Can Tell My Story? Which does not have a question mark at the end. It's a statement, who can tell my story? And she talks a lot about that and about how it's important that if you are going to tell a story from the perspective of someone from another culture, you need to literally sit at their table. So I wrote a book, I don't have it with me, it's called Hachiko Waits, and it takes place in Japan in the 1920s and 30s. And it's based on a true story of a dog who waited 10 years at a train station for his master's return. And I'm an animal person, and I really fell in love with this story. And the whole time I was writing it, I was plagued with doubt, and I felt like, really, somebody from Japan should be writing this story. But nobody was. So I thought, well, it's either the story doesn't get told or I have to do my work. So I did a copious amount of research. I was not able to go to Japan, and of course I couldn't go to Japan in the 1920s and 30s. So I found a Japanese woman who grew up in the 1920s and 30s and was a retired research librarian. And I asked her, well, at first I didn't ask her if she would help me with my book. I met her and spent some social time with her and waited for her to ask me how she could help me, because that is more of a polite way to do things. And so she was very excited that I was writing the story and bringing it to American children. And when she read the final product, before it was published, she cried. And she said, "You gave me back my childhood." And that's how I felt like I had succeeded. So I worked probably harder on that book trying to get it right. And she gave me such interesting feedback, things that probably people who aren't familiar with Japanese culture would not notice. But I really cared that I got the smallest details right. So, for example, I described a little boy and his mom going to the train station, and I described the kimono that the mother was wearing, and my friend said, "That kimono is too beautiful. That is not something you would wear to a train station." So it's like, oh, that's interesting to know that, depending on the material, depending on the style, depending on the pattern. So, if you read the book, or many books like it, you have no idea of the hours and hours and hours of research a careful writer goes through to get details right. So that's one perspective. The other perspective is that I am an out lesbian, and so I notice when out lesbians write books that have lesbian characters and how they often feel different to me when somebody who is not an out lesbian is writing a book about a lesbian character. So I just think that you have to ask yourself the questions that I listed when I started talking about this, and you really have to do your homework, literally. And I think you have to get it vetted by someone from that culture or community, and you really have to listen to them. And you have to be willing to admit that you made mistakes and fix them.
Okay, so I also do a lot of research for my stories. You've probably gotten that picture already. So even though I'm Jewish, I was right. My early books took place in the ghettos in Eastern Europe in the late 1800s. Well, they don't exist anymore, and that certainly was a long time ago. So actually, I had to do a lot of research to recreate this experience of Jews in the late 1800s in the ghettos. I did have, similar to you in a way, I had a cousin who grew up in the ghetto, and she, of course, has passed away a long time ago, but I did a lot of research, and then I brought the published book to her. She said something similar. She said, this is just the way it was. So even though I'm Jewish, I could have botched it very easily by not doing a lot of research. So I guess that's one of my points, is that you have to do a lot of research if you're going to set a book in a different time, a different place, or a different culture. Or so with the Native American books, like I said, there weren't any in the classroom. That was one of my reasons. I also was very drawn to the cultures, and there were some wonderful museums in the Northwest that have the masks and the totems, and I would just get the chills when I would see them. So it meant a lot to me to do the research, and we did have it vetted. As a matter of fact, this book, so neither one of us, the author or the illustrator, were Native American. I'm not sure you would find that being published now, actually. So this illustrator, Will Hillenbrand, drew his sketches, and they were totally off. The way, the places that this tribe lived in, this group of people lived in, didn't live in those kind of houses. So we went to the University of Washington, found some experts, and he totally changed his sketches and then his illustrations based on the feedback. So that was a lesson for me. And like I said, I don't think you could get a book published now unless at least one person was of that culture for Native Americans.
How do you feel about that? Is that
Well, to talk about what you said, if somebody else did a Jewish children's book who wasn't Jewish and they made a mistake, I would be offended. So I think you just have to do your work and do your research, and then I think it's okay with me. But I know a woman who was Jewish who did a Jewish children's book, and she had some things wrong, and I was offended. So when I read her book, So I think for me, personally, it depends on if you depict it in a way that's true. But that's not true for the market, I don't think, right now. I think they prefer, to have something done by a person of that culture. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but...
Yeah. Well, Hachiko Waits, the illustrator, is Japanese, and my editor felt very, very strongly that we needed to find a Japanese illustrator, and we did, and she did a wonderful job.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I didn't sell any more of the stories, so I think that says it right there.
Well, I feel like the job of a fiction writer is to get into the hearts and the minds of characters that are not like me, because what kind of novel would I be writing if all the characters were like me? I mean, you have to be able to somehow figure out who these characters are when they have a lot of their life experiences are different than your own life experience. The way I hope that I do that is to start at the what I call the core, and to think about who this person or persons, who they are at the bottom, and then kind of layer on other things about their personality, including things like their sexuality. And in my mind, that's a way of making them not stereotypes, but actual people who come from, a gut level. Having said that, when I wrote Parrotfish, I really did not know very much about what it meant to be transgender. And so I wanted to write the book because there was only one other book out there about a transgender person, and it was for teenagers. It was Luna by Julianne Peters, and it had kind of a sad ending. And I had talked to my friend Toby, who's quite a bit younger than me, about this, and he was very upset about that book, and he said there really needs to be a book for teenagers that has a happy ending. So about a transgender person who has, and there's a happy ending. So I felt like with his help I would be able to do it. And so I did a lot of research on my own, and then I talked to him and asked him, every possible question, including embarrassing ones. And from that, wrote the book, and then had him go back over this book several times so that I really was not making any mistakes. And still, that book was published, and people, transgender people would say to me, "Well, this was wrong. This is not the way it happened to me." And so I think you have to be prepared for that, because everybody has their own story, and you can't write everybody's story. You can only write one story, and there are going to be people who believe that you haven't done it correctly. So in a way, you have to have a thick skin about it. You do the very best you can, and then you put it out there and you let it live its life, and some people will like it and some people won't.
Now I want to open this up to your questions.
Somebody has a question.
Everyone's smiling. I saw a lot of people smiling here, so you don't even have to talk in the mic. Just you can ask them about anything. Yes, Lily. Do you want to? Sorry. Oh, you don't need that. She doesn't need this, does she?
So, Barbara, I think you had mentioned that you were a preschool teacher for a bit, and I think I read that Leslea, were you a preschool teacher at one point too?
Yes.
I was wondering, how you think that affected your ability to write for kids and about kids, and just how experience with kids played into your picture books.
Well, I think it helped me to hear how kids talk and what kids were like, and I think it helped a lot. I also, when I was just storytelling, I had the immediate reaction of the kids, and so I developed the story with that. So I think it really helped develop my whole career. And then I continued to teach. I taught older kids, middle school, taught them writing for 10 years. So it was nice to be able to hear their dialogue. And I'm the kind of person that listens in on conversations. I always have been. Like, if I go to a restaurant, I hear the people at the next table. I think that might be common to a lot of writers, and it's sort of annoying to people you go with. But on buses, everywhere I go, I hear dialogue, and I hear people, and it just feeds into my writing. And I get ideas all the time, so I carry little, pads of paper with me, and I write them down. And so, yes, I've gotten ideas from kids, from bus rides, from, reading books. And sometimes I'll just get a germ of an idea or a piece of dialogue, and I'll write it down. But I love overhearing conversations. I've heard some pretty interesting ones, actually, in airports especially. Did you want to?
I think more than, I had a very short-lived career as a daycare teacher. For me, what's most important when I write for kids is to tap into the inner kid inside of me, to try and remember what it was like to be that young, and what made me laugh and what made me sad and what was I curious about, and to write out of that more than the being around kids. Because I was not a good teacher, because I just wanted to be writing. So I would just sort of be spacing out, thinking about story ideas, like, oh, that kid's standing on a chair. I better deal with that.
Well, why don't we thank our authors, and you can come up and ask your questions and have a snack and meet the others. Thank you so much.